60 years ago, 13 men stood on a street corner in San Bernardino and started a motorcycle club. The FBI would eventually call one of the most violent criminal organizations in the western United States. They picked a name, a color, and a symbol, and from those three decisions alone, a green flag spread across 2 hemispheres, into 7 countries, and into a war that is still being fought today. This is the story of how the Vagos rose. Urdu, where it all began. To understand how it started, you have to go back to San Bernardino, California, in the early 1960s. Locals called it Urdu. In the biker world, it was sacred ground. The Second World War had already left its mark on a generation of men who knew brotherhood under pressure, loud engines, and the constant edge of danger. When they came home, civilian life felt flat by comparison. Quiet, predictable, stripped of everything that had once made them feel alive. The motorcycle filled that gap. The Harley-Davidson wasn't just a machine anymore. It was an escape, a symbol of freedom. For a lot of these men, it was a quiet, rolling act of rebellion against a life they were never built to live. There's a label that gets attached to clubs like this one, and it goes back even further than San Bernardino. The term 1%er is said to trace back to 1947 to a riot in Hollister, California, after the American Motorcyclist Association supposedly stated that 99% of motorcyclists were law-abiding citizens, leaving the other 1% as outlaws. The AMA itself has never produced a record of making that statement publicly. True or not, the label stuck, and clubs that operated outside AMA sanctioning wore it as a badge of honor instead of an insult. By the time the Vagos came together, that 1% identity was already baked into the culture they were stepping into. San Bernardino was already a hotbed for this kind of restlessness. The Hells Angels had taken root there years earlier. So had a club called the Psychos, out of nearby Redlands. And it's the Psychos where this story really begins, because that's where the founders of the Vagos came from first. Inside the Psychos, the same thing that breaks apart half the clubs in outlaw history started happening. Ego, territory, disagreements over direction. 13 members decided they'd had enough. Under a rider named Rudy Esparza, who went by the road name Puro, they walked away and built something of their own. Some accounts place the breakaway in 1964. The club's own internal history puts the official date on a specific street corner, 8th and Davidson in San Bernardino, in 1965. Either way, what mattered wasn't the date. It was the decision, 13 men deciding they didn't want a seat at somebody else's table. They wanted to build their own. The founding roster reads like a roll call out of an old western. Puro as president, Gil Carrasco as vice president, a member known only as Whitey running the books as secretary and treasurer, a rider named Lucky as sergeant-at-arms. And then the rest of the 13, Freddie Ruiz, Harley Hogg, Crazy John Estrada, Tom Tom, Moose, Squirrel, Alex Estrada, and Little John Bocanegra. Before they were Vagos, some of them had passed through other clubs too, including one called El Diablo. In the churn of 1960s, Southern California biker culture, that wasn't unusual. Clubs absorbed each other, split apart, and reformed constantly. The question was never really whether the Vagos would survive that churn. It was whether they'd be the ones doing the absorbing or the ones getting absorbed. Within a few years, more chapters were springing up across California, and the answer became obvious. A name, a color, a god. Even the name carried weight. 2 other names were on the table before the vote: Coffin Dodgers, Satan's Saints. In the end, it was Puro who suggested Vagos, and the room agreed. Vagos is Spanish, usually translated as wanderers or vagabonds, though in certain street use, it can also carry the meaning of lazy or street smart, someone who's always up to something. For the founders, it was more than a word. It was a rejection of the 9-to-5, the mortgage, the quiet conformity that post-war America expected from its returning men. It helps to understand exactly what that conformity looked like on the ground in San Bernardino County at the time. This was Kaiser Steel country, a region built almost entirely around the mill in nearby Fontana and the rail yards and citrus packing plants scattered across the valley, the kind of blue-collar economy that promised a steady paycheck in exchange for a lifetime spent inside a fence. For men who'd already seen combat, That trade looked less like stability and more like a slow surrender. The motorcycle club offered something the assembly line never could, a hierarchy you actually chose to belong to, built on loyalty instead of a punch clock. That tension between the disciplined, regimented world of post-war industrial labor and the chosen brotherhood of the open road runs underneath almost everything that followed. Alongside the name came the color, green, a direct nod to the founders' Mexican heritage and a hard break from the established color codes of the outlaw world, where red and white already belonged to the Hells Angels and black and gold belonged to others. In a scene where colors were closely guarded territory, that single choice gave the Vagos an identity nobody could mistake for someone else's. But a name and a color weren't enough. Every serious outlaw club needs a symbol, something that rides on the back of every cut and tells the world exactly who you are before you say a word. For the Vagos, that symbol became one of the most recognizable images in American biker history. Loki, the Norse god of mischief, muscle-bound and grinning, riding a motorcycle straight out of myth. The patch has its own origin story. According to club history, it was designed by a member of the Burdu chapter while he was sitting in prison. The inspiration reportedly came from an illustration in a 1960s issue of Life magazine, a piece called Return from Hell, showing a winged, devil-like figure. From behind bars, that image got reworked. The wings became a motorcycle, the devil became Loki. And the whole thing got set against a bold field of green that matched everything the club had already decided about itself. The choice of Loki specifically wasn't an accident. Plenty of outlaw clubs lean on skulls, reapers, death imagery, the obvious stuff. Loki is different. In Norse mythology, he's the trickster, the outsider who doesn't respect the rules of gods or men, who causes chaos not for chaos's sake, but because the rules themselves were never built for someone like him. He's dangerous, unpredictable, and impossible to fully contain, but when the established order starts to crack, he's the one who's still standing. For a club that saw itself as permanently outside the lines, the so-called 99% of law-abiding society drew for everyone else. That symbolism fit like a key in a lock. The code, patches, brotherhood, and the price of the cut. To really understand how deep this system runs, you have to look at something most outsiders never notice: the patchwork itself. Nothing on a Vagos cut is random. Every piece is earned, and every piece tells you exactly where a man stands. At the top of the vest sits the top rocker, stretched across the shoulders, reading Vagos in bold letters. Simple, but it tells everyone in the room exactly who that man answers to. Dead center is the Loki patch itself, the muscle-bound trickster on his bike, often highlighted in red against the green field, broadcasting the club's identity at its core. Below that sits the bottom rocker, naming the chapter's territory: SO, Cal, Arizona, Mexico. It's geography, but in this world, geography is also pride, and sometimes it's a fuse waiting to be lit. There's the MF patch, standing for motorcycle family, which a member doesn't get handed to him. It comes after a full probationary period, once the chapter has voted him in as a complete, validated member of the Brotherhood. There's the number 22, a coded nod to the 22nd letter of the alphabet, V, for Vagos. Subtle, but every member in the room knows exactly what it means the second they see it. There's a motto the club uses on coins, patches, and merchandise: "We give what we get," a line that cuts two ways, depending on whether you're a brother or an enemy. And then there's the phrase you'll find on patches, on club merchandise, and tattooed permanently into skin: VFFV, Vagos forever, forever Vagos. It's not a slogan you wear lightly. In this world, it's meant as a lifetime sentence of loyalty, the kind you can't take back once it's under your skin. None of that, though, gets handed out for free. Becoming a Vagos in the first place is its own slow, deliberate process, built to weed out anyone who isn't fully committed before they ever see the inside of a chapter meeting. It starts as a hang-around, someone who's known, watched, and vetted, but holds no official standing. From there, a man moves into a prospecting period, sometimes stretching on for a year or more, where he's expected to prove himself through grunt work, mandatory attendance at every run and event, and standing guard outside while full members meet behind closed doors. Only men are eligible. He has to be at least 21, own an American-made cruiser motorcycle, and hold a valid license. And even after all of that, he still needs a sponsor, an existing member willing to vouch for him personally, before the chapter votes him in. It's a system built less around finding the toughest guy in the room, and more around finding the guy who'll still be loyal 5, 10, 20 years down the line, long after the initial thrill has worn off. The Brotherhood doesn't stop at the men wearing the patch either. Like most 1%er clubs, the Vagos built a wider orbit around the core membership, an entire ecosystem of people who keep the machine running without ever holding a vote in chapter meetings. Wives and girlfriends, often called old ladies inside the culture, carry their own informal status, expected to stay loyal and stay quiet about club business in equal measure. Younger riders too junior to prospect, yet sometimes fall in as hangarounds for years, running errands and proving themselves long before they're formally invited to start the clock on full membership. Investigators have also pointed to smaller, regional clubs functioning as so-called support or puppet clubs in certain territories, satellite organizations that wear their own patches but answer, in practice, to the Green Nation above them. It's a structure built less like a single gang and more like a holding company, layers of loyalty stacked on top of each other, each one absorbing pressure before it ever reaches the top. The machine, structure, money, and the Green Nation. Behind all of that symbolism and ritual sits something far less romantic, a structure. Despite how it might look from a passing car on the highway, the Vagos were never just a loose collection of guys who liked to ride together. From the start, they organized more like a chain of command than a social club, and as the chapters multiplied, the second chapter in Victorville, absorbing the old Cossacks Motorcycle Club, the third in Los Angeles, built from the Talons, then San Gorgonio Pass, San Gabriel Valley, pulling in members from clubs called the Dirty Dozen, the Highwaymen, the Verdugos, the Vendettas, and the Ghostmen. Then, Monterey, Pomona Valley, and Antelope Valley, control became the whole point. National leadership needed a way to make sure an order given in San Bernardino actually landed, intact, in a chapter 4 states away. Every chapter, no matter how small, tends to anchor itself around a physical clubhouse, usually an unmarked building in an industrial stretch of town, windows blacked out, a security camera bolted over the door, sometimes a chain-link fence, and a guard dog out front for good measure. To a passing driver, it looks like nothing. A warehouse, a converted garage. To the club, it's the nerve center, where chapter meetings happen, where new prospects get voted in or voted out, where parties and funerals alike get held, and where, according to search warrants executed over the decades, investigators have repeatedly found exactly the kind of evidence that turns a vague suspicion into a federal case: weapons, drug ledgers, and club records laying out who owes what to whom. That system lives in a governing document the club calls its international and national bylaws. These rules aren't whispered between a select few. They're distributed across chapters, so a member in Nevada and a member in Hawaii are, in theory, operating under the exact same code. A huge part of those bylaws deals with money. Every chapter is required to pay dues, often referred to internally as taxes, sent up the chain to national officers. That money funds legal defense for members who end up in custody, supports families on the inside, and bankrolls the expansion of what the club calls the Green Nation into new territory. Structure inside the Vagos isn't only about cash flow, though. It's about behavior. The code of conduct is strict, and breaking it doesn't come with a warning email. Certain rules are completely non-negotiable. Heroin use, referred to inside the club as hype, is banned outright, treated as a direct threat to the stability of the entire organization. When internal discipline is required, it typically runs through the sergeant-at-arms. Members are expected to handle one another with respect, but any real conflict, any violence between brothers, has to be approved and managed through that role specifically. It's a pressure valve, designed to keep personal disputes from tearing a chapter apart from the inside. Geography mattered just as much as bylaws in how the club actually made its money. The Inland Empire and the high desert towns east of Los Angeles weren't just convenient places for a biker club to set up shop. They were close enough to the freeway corridors feeding the rest of California, isolated enough to keep clandestine labs hidden from casual notice, and far enough from the coastal price of real estate that a clubhouse, a stash house, and a chop shop could all sit on the same dead-end street without drawing much attention. Law enforcement officials have described methamphetamine specifically as the engine underneath most of the club's serious criminal cases over the decades, supplemented by marijuana trafficking in the chapters that stretched into Mexico, smuggling routes that ran in both directions across the border. By the time the club expanded into Arizona, Nevada, and beyond, it was effectively running a desert supply chain stretching from the methamphetamine corridors of the Southwest straight up into Canada. It's worth pointing out, too, that the Vagos have never been shy about using the legal system to protect that structure when they felt it was under attack from the outside. As far back as 1990, the club sued police agencies and walked away with a $2 million settlement after arguing they'd been the target of sustained, large-scale police abuse throughout the early 1980s. It was an early sign of something that would define the club for the next 3 decades, an organization that absolutely operated outside the law when it suited them, but that also understood, with surprising precision, exactly how to use the law against the people trying to take them down. The violence, what the club was really built on, that internal discipline and legal savvy mattered because the violence the club was capable of producing showed up early, and it showed up hard. In 1974, less than a decade after the founding, 4 Vagos members were convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of a University of New Mexico student named William Velton. It was an early, brutal signal of exactly what this organization was capable of producing, and it set a tone that would define the club's relationship with law enforcement for the next 50 years. That tone repeated itself over and over through the decades that followed, in incidents that rarely made national news, but built, piece by piece, the case files investigators would eventually use against the club. In October 1998, after a 2-year undercover investigation, police arrested more than a dozen Vagos members on kidnapping, drug, and weapons charges. In September 2004, state agents arrested 26 members and seized more than $125,000 in cash, drugs, and guns. In December 2007, 6 members were arrested after a man who'd announced he was leaving the club was beaten at a motorcycle shop in Grants Pass, Oregon, then driven to his own home in a botched robbery attempt, the kind of internal enforcement action that sent a clear message to anyone else thinking about walking away. In June 2009, 3 members were arrested in San Jose, accused of meeting a woman at a nightclub, offering her a ride home, and instead taking her to the club's local clubhouse, where she was beaten and sexually assaulted. And in August 2011, the club's violence spilled across state lines entirely, when Vagos members and a rival club called the Galloping Goose got into a shootout on Interstate 44 near Waynesville, Missouri, shutting down traffic on a major highway over what amounted to a territorial dispute 1,000 miles from Purdue. But the operation that did the most lasting damage to the club's internal security didn't come from a shootout or a raid. It came from the inside, and it came from 2 different directions at once. Operation 22 Green, the men who got inside. The first informant was a street criminal named George Rowe. His motive was personal. A friend of his had disappeared after a run-in with the club, and in 2003, he volunteered to go undercover as part of an operation that became known simply as Operation 22. Over roughly 3 years inside, Rowe gathered evidence that would eventually feed convictions for crimes as serious as murder. He'd later write a book about the experience, one that would go on to draw interest from Hollywood producers looking to turn his undercover years into a feature film. The second informant ran almost in parallel, and his path into the club was even stranger. His real name was Ashley Charles Wyatt, but the world would come to know him by his road name, Tijuana Charles, and later by the name on the cover of his memoir, Charles Falco. In 2001, Falco was reportedly pulling in $500,000 a year manufacturing and dealing methamphetamine. When the DEA raided his home, they gave him a choice: 22 years in prison without parole, or work as an informant. He chose the second option. A few years of small-time drug cases later, he found himself getting pulled out of jail repeatedly to testify against people he'd worked with before, a pattern dangerous enough that he asked his handlers to place him in solitary confinement instead. just to avoid suspicion from other inmates. He spent nearly a week locked in a windowless 6x9 cell with the lights never turning off before the ATF handed him a much bigger assignment: infiltrate the Vagos motorcycle club from the ground up. Falco had no biker background and had never ridden a Harley in his life. The ATF had to build him a believable identity from scratch, starting with the bike itself, because inside this world, the machine you ride says almost as much about you as the patch on your back. A club member known as Lizard took Falco's ATF-issued motorcycle and rebuilt it into something the Vagos would actually accept as a real club bike. That single favor created something far more dangerous than a paint job. It created a debt, a social obligation Falco now owed inside an organization where unpaid debts can get a man killed. He earned the road name Quick after throwing a fast punch during a bar fight, and over time, he worked his way up into a leadership position inside the Victorville chapter, eventually serving as an officer, second in command at the local level, with direct visibility into the club's day-to-day criminal operations. He later described the work as a constant, low-grade panic that never fully switched off, knowing that a single inconsistent answer, one detail that didn't line up with the backstory the ATF had built for him, could end the operation and end his life in the same conversation. There was no backup waiting outside the clubhouse door. If something went wrong inside, it went wrong alone. The full operation was codenamed 22 Green, run under ATF handler Darren Kozlowski. And when it finally came down on the 9th of March 2006, it wasn't subtle. Roughly 700 law enforcement personnel from the ATF and local agencies executed coordinated raids that investigators would later call one of the largest combined law enforcement actions ever conducted in Southern California. 25 members and associates were arrested. Investigators seized 95 illegal firearms, $6,000 in cash, and 2 stolen motorcycles. One ATF agent summed up what they'd found in 3 words: guns, drugs, and death. After it was over, Falco was pulled out and placed in witness protection. He didn't stay retired for long. Within a couple of years, he was back undercover, this time infiltrating the Mongols and the outlaws as well, eventually becoming one of only 3 men in recorded history to successfully infiltrate 3 of the largest outlaw motorcycle gangs in the world, in total spending around 7 years of his life undercover. Across all of it, his work led to 62 arrests on charges ranging from assault to murder. He later called the Vagos, in his own words, a mafia on wheels. Men, he said, had no interest in the romanticized version of biker life television had built, just thugs, in his telling, with a flag. Hemet. Urban terrorism and the lawsuit nobody saw coming. If the infiltrations exposed the club from the inside, the next chapter of this story exposed something else entirely. Just how far the Vagos were willing to go to defend their name in public, even against the government itself. That fight started in Hemet, California, and it started with something that looked, on the surface, almost too strange to be real. On the 31st of December 2009, the unmarked headquarters of the Hemet Gang Task Force was filled with natural gas, pumped through a hole someone had drilled into the roof. 2 task force members detected the smell and backed out just before the building could have gone up. The day before that, a Vagos funeral had been held at a church right next door. Weeks later, on the 23rd of February 2010, a task force member opened a security gate and triggered a homemade gun, rigged to the hinge, a shot that came within inches of hitting him. Law enforcement's response was immediate and overwhelming. On the 17th of March 2010, in a sweep that would become known as Operation Everywhere, 400 officers from 60 different agencies hit 73 locations across California, Nevada, Arizona, and Utah simultaneously, a level of coordination usually reserved for cartel takedowns rather than a single motorcycle club. More than 30 Vagos members were arrested. Investigators seized weapons, drugs, and uncovered a working methamphetamine lab. California's Attorney General at the time, Jerry Brown, didn't mince words, calling the booby trap campaign an act of urban terrorism and putting a $200,000 reward on the table for information. Riverside County District Attorney Rod Pacheco told reporters the Vagos posed an extreme threat to law enforcement and accused the club of actively trying to plant members inside police agencies to sabotage investigations from within. There was just one problem. As the investigation continued, the theory didn't hold up. The booby traps, the gas, the gate gun, none of it connected back to the club. Two individuals with no ties whatsoever to the Vagos were eventually convicted instead. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became the beginning of something almost nobody expected from a so-called outlaw club, a courtroom counterattack. In March 2011, the Vagos sued Riverside County for defamation, naming Pacheco personally, along with a sheriff's captain and the Hemet police chief. The lawsuit alleged that officials had stood in front of cameras and called Vagos members cockroaches and terrorists, language the club argued had cost members their jobs, gotten them barred from bars and restaurants, and even kept them out of church services. On the 1st of August 2011, Riverside County settled. As part of the agreement, the county publicly cleared the Vagos of any involvement in the Hemet attacks. The club's attorney, Joseph Yanni, said afterward that it had never been about the money. It was a strange kind of victory, an outlaw motorcycle club using the same legal system it spent every other day, defying and winning. But while that legal battle was still unfolding, a different kind of confrontation was already building, one that had nothing to do with courtrooms and everything to do with a casino floor in Nevada. Sparks, the night it all exploded. The roots of the Vagos' war with the Hells Angels go back further than Hemet, further than any single incident. It's a rivalry built into the structure of the outlaw world itself, fought over territory, respect, and dominance inside what insiders call the one-percenter hierarchy. Some of that history is almost a mirror image of how clubs like the Vagos came to exist in the first place. For decades, the Hells Angels operated an unofficial whites-only culture, and clubs built largely around Hispanic and Latino membership, the Vagos among them, found themselves locked out from the start, left to build power on their own terms instead of being granted any. As far back as 2001, a brawl erupted between the two clubs in Costa Mesa, California. In 2010, a dispute over which club got to occupy a Starbucks in Santa Cruz spiraled into a full gunfight in Chino Valley, Arizona. More than 50 rounds fired in the open. Those were warning shots. End quote. The real explosion came the following year. The 23rd of September 2011, the Street Vibrations motorcycle rally was in full swing at John Ascuaga's Nugget Casino in Sparks, Nevada, the casino floor packed with bikers, tourists, and slot machine noise. Outside, thousands of motorcycles lined the streets for blocks, the kind of rally that turns an entire downtown into a sea of leather and chrome for a weekend. Inside, the two clubs had been circling each other in the same building for hours, separate groups occupying separate corners of the casino floor, the kind of standoff that regulars in that world know how to read as a warning sign long before anyone throws a punch. What started as a confrontation between Vagos and Hells Angels members near the gaming tables escalated, within seconds, into a full-blown brawl, fists and chairs and bodies slamming into machines as gamblers scattered for the exits. Then came the gunfire. Surveillance footage, later reviewed by investigators, showed the chaos lasting only a matter of seconds, but in that window, an entire decade of simmering tension between the two clubs detonated in front of dozens of terrified tourists who had nothing to do with either side. When it was over, Jeffrey Pettigrew, the 51-year-old president of the Hells Angels San Jose chapter, known to friends as Jethro, was dead, shot from behind during the chaos. Multiple Vagos members were wounded. The next day, a Vagos member was shot in a drive-by at the same rally, proof the violence hadn't burned itself out overnight. 6 days later, police arrested Ernesto Gonzalez, known inside the club as Romeo, at the University of California, San Francisco, identifying him as the shooter. A Vagos member believed to have instigated the fight in the first place was arrested separately that December and would later plead guilty to second-degree murder under a bargaining agreement. The crackdown that followed didn't wait for a trial date. Less than 2 weeks after the casino shooting, investigators hit Southern California hard, arresting 10 more Vagos members suspected of drug trafficking and violence tied to the club. In October 2011, officers from the San Bernardino Police Department and the California Department of Justice raided the Colton home of Pastor Palafox, the club's international president. Palafox wasn't there when they arrived, but agents left with evidence in hand. Palafox had been with the club for years by that point, rising through the chapters to the very top of its leadership structure, the man whose name would appear again and again over the next decade, on indictments, on raid warrants, and eventually, after years of fighting it, on a not guilty verdict. Gonzalez's own account of that night, he testified that he watched Pettigrew and another Hell's Angel kicking a fellow Vagos member in the head hard enough that he believed they would kill him, and that he opened fire to protect his brother, not on anyone's orders. Prosecutors told a different story entirely, arguing the killing was a planned hit, a green light passed down specifically to silence Pettigrew as part of the long-running feud between the clubs. In 2013, a jury believed the prosecution. Gonzalez was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with parole eligibility after 20 years. Pettigrew's mother told the court that shooting a man in the back was the act of a coward, and the sentencing judge agreed there was overwhelming evidence of guilt. It looked, for a while, like the case was closed. Then, in December 2015, the Nevada Supreme Court reversed everything. During deliberations, the jury had sent the judge a question about what it actually meant, legally, to be part of a conspiracy to commit murder, a question that suggested real confusion about whether Gonzalez had acted alone or as part of an orchestrated plan. The judge never adequately answered it. The state's highest court ruled that failure, combined with other procedural errors, had denied Gonzalez a fair trial and ordered the entire case retried from scratch. Gonzalez walked out of prison on bail, the conviction wiped clean, awaiting a new trial that, on paper, hadn't even started yet. That reversal changed everything about how authorities approached the Vagos going forward. Rather than retry a single man for a single killing in state court, where one confused jury instruction had already blown up years of work, the Washoe County District Attorney's Office began quietly coordinating with federal agencies on something far bigger, a case that wouldn't just go after the shooter in that casino, but after the entire structure of the club that put him there. The RICO War, the government's biggest bet. That case landed in September 2016, when a federal grand jury in Las Vegas returned a sweeping racketeering indictment against 23 alleged Vagos members and associates. The roster read like a directory of the club's leadership: Pastor Fausto Palafox, known as Tata, the organization's international president; Albert Lopez, known as Al; Albert Perez, known as Dragon Man; James Gillespie, known as Jimbo, 68 years old at the time of the indictment, one of the oldest men named; Andrew Lozano, known as Hulk; Ernesto Gonzalez, still carrying the Romeo name from years earlier, by then a former president of the club's chapter in Nicaragua; Victor Ramirez, known as Slick; James Henderson, known as CJ; Stephen Carr, known as Big Steve; Robert Coleman, known as Mayhem; Jeremy Halgett, known as Maniac; Paul Vole, known as Shister; John Seamer, known as Rocky; Bradley Campos, known as Candyman. The indictment didn't treat the Vagos as a loose collection of criminals who happened to wear the same patch. It described a transnational gang with 87 or more chapters spread across at least 7 countries on 4 continents. 75 chapters in the United States alone, 54 of those concentrated in Nevada and California. The charges included racketeering, conspiracy, murder, robbery, kidnapping, and aggravated assault, with Gonzalez's killing of Pettigrew named as one of the central predicate acts tying the whole enterprise together. The trial that followed was massive. Jury selection began in July 2019 in a Las Vegas federal courthouse, with 8 defendants ultimately standing trial together: Palafox, Lopez, Perez, Gillespie, by then 72, Gonzalez, Campos, and 2 more members, Cesar Morales and Diego Garcia. For months, prosecutors built their case around a central witness whose testimony was supposed to tie the Sparks shooting directly to a club-wide kill order. In September 2019, that witness admitted, under oath, that he had fabricated the story. The case never recovered. On the 24th of February, 2020, after roughly 17 hours of deliberation spread across 4 days, the jury returned not guilty verdicts on every single charge for all 8 defendants. Outside the courthouse, Defense attorney Dan Hill told reporters it was what happens when the government tries to put people away with tricks and liars. Gonzalez's own attorney put it even more bluntly, arguing his client had saved lives by stopping 2 active shooters, not committed murder, and that the Vagos was a motorcycle club, not a racketeering enterprise. 2 months later, a federal judge dismissed the remaining charges against 11 additional defendants, closing the books on one of the most ambitious RICO prosecutions ever brought against an American outlaw motorcycle club. One defendant, Jeremy Halgat, continued fighting separate drug and weapons charges that had been pending against him since 2013, but the broader racketeering case against the club's leadership was finished. Double jeopardy protections meant Washoe County couldn't simply put Gonzalez on trial again either, even though the underlying state case had technically never been resolved. For the Vagos, it wasn't just an acquittal. It was proof that even under the full weight of a federal racketeering case built from a 4-year-old reversed murder conviction, the organization's structure could absorb the hit and keep standing, something most rival clubs facing similar prosecutions never managed to pull off. Law enforcement analysts have long placed the Vagos a tier below the so-called Big Four of American outlaw motorcycle clubs, the Hells Angels, the Outlaws, the Bandidos, and the Pagans. After 2020, that ranking started to look a little less settled than it used to. There's a pattern underneath almost every collapsed case in this story, and it isn't really about evidence, it's about silence. In outlaw motorcycle culture, cooperating with law enforcement isn't just discouraged, it's treated as a betrayal worse than almost any crime a member could commit against an outsider. Witnesses recant. Key testimony falls apart on cross-examination. Members who might know the most stay quiet the longest, because the cost of talking is rarely just a ruined reputation. It's the kind of silence that turns a 700-officer raid into 25 arrests instead of 50 convictions, and a star witness's testimony into the very thing that sinks a years-long federal case instead of winning it. The Green Nation goes global. While all of this was unfolding inside American courtrooms, the club's footprint was already stretching well beyond American borders, and the story of how that happened is almost comically low-key compared to everything else. According to club law, roughly 15 years after the founding, a senior member known as Lucky, the original sergeant-at-arms, was in Ensenada, Mexico, for a 4th of July softball tournament. His wife spotted something strange: a group of local riders wearing cuts with the name Vagos stitched across them, except the colors were wrong, black and gray with orange and yellow, centered on an eagle instead of Loki. Lucky tracked them down. Their president went by Tati, and they were riding out of Mexicali, partying that same weekend alongside another local club called the Solo Angels. Instead of treating it as a trademark violation, Lucky brought the discovery back to the club's national president at the time, known as Prophet, and to senior Burdu members, Lenko, Loco, and Crazy Johnny. Together, they made a decision that would define the next 4 decades of the club's growth. Rather than shutting the Mexicali riders down, they absorbed them, handed them the real colors, and brought them under the official Vagos bylaws. What started as an accidental discovery at a softball game became the foundation of the club's entire Mexican presence, chapters that today stretch across Baja California, into Jalisco, and into Mexico City itself. Canada told a different story. By 2015, reports out of Ontario suggested a noticeable number of Vagos members had patched over entirely to a rival organization, the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, before that club's American chapter structure itself dissolved in 2018. In the outlaw world, allegiances shift fast when pressure builds, whether that pressure comes from law enforcement or from a bigger rival flexing its muscle nearby. Despite that setback, the broader international expansion kept moving. By 2013, the club had planted chapters in Australia and Sweden. Law enforcement estimates of total membership have shifted dramatically over the years as that growth compounded, roughly 600 members across 24 chapters, according to one FBI assessment in 2014, climbing toward the 87-plus chapters described in the 2016 federal indictment, and toward estimates today running into the thousands, with confirmed chapters now operating across Germany, Ireland, France, and Belgium, in addition to the long-established presence across the American Southwest and Mexico. and even outposts reported as far away as Central and South America, including Nicaragua, where González himself once held a chapter presidency. The German chapters in particular show how far the brand has traveled from that street corner in San Bernardino. One Vagos chapter operating in Germany has gone by the name Steel Legion, riders wearing the same green and the same grinning Loki patch, thousands of miles from the desert towns where the symbol was first stitched together, operating under bylaws written decades earlier in a language most of them don't even speak natively. Henderson. Ambush on the highway. That kind of footprint doesn't stay quiet for long, and the Hells Angels rivalry that had gone cold for nearly a decade after the Sparks shooting reignited with a vengeance in 2022. In April of that year, a Hells Angels member was shot and killed in a bar in San Bernardino, the literal birthplace of the Vagos Club. Investigators believe what happened next may have been retaliation for that killing. On the 29th of May, 2022, Memorial Day weekend, a group of Vagos riders was returning from the Flags Over the Dam ride near Boulder City and the Hoover Dam when a group of Hells Angels members began following them. On US Highway 95 near Wagon Wheel Drive in Henderson, Nevada, the Hells Angels opened fire on the riders ahead of them. Witnesses described riders being run off their bikes before the shooting even started, knocked to the pavement and kicked, while a Hells Angels member stood up and opened fire into the group. 7 people were shot before it was over, shutting the highway down for hours while paramedics worked the scene. Police arrested Richard DeVries, the 66-year-old president of the Hells Angels Las Vegas chapter, along with 2 younger prospects, Russell Smith and Stephen Allo, on charges of attempted murder. Months later, a superseding federal indictment brought the total number of charged co-defendants in the case to 8, including an associate known only by a road name, who was booked into custody in October 2022 on $250,000 bail. Investigators noted that the Las Vegas Hells Angels chapter itself was tiny by comparison, only a handful of full patch members and a few prospects, against a Vagos presence in the same county numbering in the dozens, a mismatch that made the ambush tactics all the more deliberate. One Vagos member who testified before the grand jury, Ted Lempart, described the ambush in blunt terms, calling it cowardly, and connecting it directly to a pattern he said he'd personally witnessed before, in Laughlin and in Reno, and now in Henderson. In his view, the message behind each attack was the same, an enemy testing whether Nevada had gone soft. Prosecutors building the federal case against DeVries and his co-defendants leaned heavily on that same framing, arguing in court filings that the ambush wasn't a spontaneous bar fight that spilled onto a highway, but a coordinated act of retaliation planned in advance, with riders positioned specifically to box the Vagos group in before a single shot was fired. The Mongols' War, a brotherhood turned enemy. The Mongols themselves came up through a story not all that different from the Vagos' own. Both clubs trace part of their existence back to the same root cause, a Hells Angels membership policy that, for decades, kept the club almost entirely white, pushing Hispanic and Latino riders toward forming their own organizations instead. For most of their shared history, that common origin kept the Vagos and the Mongols more often allied than opposed, 2 clubs built outside the same locked door. By 2022, that old alignment had broken down completely, replaced by a turf war just as bloody as anything the Vagos had ever fought with the Hells Angels. The Hells Angels weren't the only rivals testing that question. By 2022, a separate and increasingly violent front had opened up with the Mongols Motorcycle Club, a conflict that, according to court records, would stretch on for the next 3 years and counting. It included a shooting at a Hooters restaurant, a brawl that broke out at a Harley-Davidson dealership in Marina del Rey, and at least 1 homicide tied directly to the feud. The most recent escalation came in 2025. On March 4th, a Vagos member named Vicente Sandoval was shot to death at the Firewater Bar in Ontario, California. In April, federal prosecutors charged an alleged Mongols member, Julian Pulido, with the killing. A second alleged Mongols member, Clifford Lavoie, was accused of choking Sandoval in the moments before the shooting and was charged with assault in aid of racketeering, held without bond while he awaited trial. Court records describe the 3-year conflict as ongoing, with neither side showing signs of standing down. Investigators tracking the feud have noted that, unlike the older, more ritualized rivalry with the Hells Angels, the Mongols' conflict has played out in far more public, far less predictable settings. Restaurants, dealership parking lots, neighborhood bars, the kind of everyday locations that put bystanders at risk in a way the older feud rarely did. Law enforcement pressure on the club's domestic operations hasn't let up either. In the summer of 2024, sheriff's deputies in Kern County, California, arrested the alleged president and sergeant-at-arms of the club's Antelope Valley chapter, John Anderson and Ulysses Navarrete, after receiving reports of members harassing customers at a local business in Tehachapi. A search of Navarrete's home turned up multiple Vagos jackets, a loaded handgun hidden in a jacket pocket, another firearm concealed inside a motorcycle, and, more alarmingly, a fully automatic machine gun and a 40mm launcher. In February 2025, a separate Kern County search warrant connected to a theft investigation turned up 44 grams of methamphetamine, a loaded gun, and Vagos gang indicia in the home of another member. And in November 2024, a confrontation between Vagos and a club called Rock Machine in Phoenix, Arizona, turned fatal, leaving 2 people dead in an incident captured partly on a video that spread quickly online, with 2 Rock Machine members later charged with first-degree murder and gang-related offenses. The myth and the money, brotherhood or business. Part of how the club manages that perception happens in plain sight, online. The Vagos maintain their own public-facing website and a visible footprint on social media, posting photos from runs, charity rides, and memorials for fallen members. The same kind of content any club or fraternal organization might post. Outlaw clubs in general have benefited from a wave of pop culture fascination over the past 2 decades. Television dramas and documentaries that romanticize the brotherhood while glossing over the federal indictments. And the Vagos have not been shy about leaning into that image when it serves them, presenting the patch as heritage and community rather than as the predicate act roster a federal prosecutor might read off in court. It's a deliberate contrast, mythology on one screen, racketeering charges on another, and the gap between those 2 versions of the same club is exactly where the organization has always done its best work. So how does an organization with this much blood behind it also manage to show up every winter, handing out toys to kids in neighborhoods that fear it? Because that's the other half of this story, the half that doesn't fit cleanly into a federal indictment. Across chapters, the Vagos run charity events, toy runs especially, that in some cases bring in thousands of dollars for local families. On the club's own public-facing website, the organization presents itself the way it always has in moments like these, not as a gang, but as a motorcycle club. And when individual members do get arrested, the standard response is the same one outlaw clubs have used for decades, that it's never the whole organization, just a few bad apples acting on their own. On the surface, the charity work is a jarring contrast to everything else in this story. There are 2 honest ways to read it. 1. It gives members a genuine sense of giving something back to the same communities that mostly just fear them. 2. And this is the read, law enforcement analysts tend to favor goodwill, bought cheaply in a community, makes that community far less likely to talk to police, far less likely to produce witnesses, far less likely to let an undercover informant get anywhere close to the inner circle. Maybe it's both at once. In an organization built around the motto, "We give what we get," even charity comes with a second meaning attached. Federal prosecutors have never been shy about describing exactly what they believe they're dealing with. In the 2016 indictment, the Justice Department described the Vagos as a closed society, whose members value loyalty to the gang above everything else, who do not fear authority, and who treat witnesses to their crimes the way they treat anyone they consider disposable, through intimidation, obstruction, and fear, until the witness is too afraid to ever speak to police or testify in open court. ATF officials have used similarly blunt language for 2 decades now, calling the organization a ruthless criminal gang built on guns, drugs, and death, the kind of assessment usually reserved for cartels rather than motorcycle clubs. And yet the club's own legal record tells a more complicated story than that language suggests. a string of headline-grabbing indictments that, time and again, have ended not in convictions, but in dismissed charges, recanted testimony, and verdicts of not guilty. Why they never fall. Add it all up, and the numbers alone tell a story most rival clubs would never survive. Operation 22 Green, 25 arrests, 95 firearms seized. Operation Everywhere, 400 officers, 73 locations, more than 30 arrests, a working meth lab shut down. The 2016 federal indictment, 23, named defendants, 87 or more, chapters across 7 countries named in the charging documents themselves. 2 of the most resourced prosecutions, California and Nevada, have ever aimed at a single motorcycle club, separated by roughly a decade, and both of them ended the same way, not with the club dismantled, but with the club still standing in the courtroom hallway, free to ride home. So, why has an organization built on this much documented violence proven so difficult to permanently take down? A few explanations keep surfacing, and none of them cancel the others out. The first is structural. A club built on independent, semi-autonomous chapters spread across dozens of jurisdictions is, by design, hard to decapitate. Arrest a chapter president in California, and chapters in Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico keep functioning exactly as before, untouched by a warrant that never crossed state lines, let alone an international border. The second is cultural. The code of silence isn't just a deterrent against individual members talking. It actively poisons the kind of long-term witness testimony that RICO cases depend on to tie isolated crimes into one coordinated conspiracy, and twice now, in 2015 and again in 2020. That exact weak point in the prosecution's chain has been the thing that brought the whole case down. The third is financial. Decades of collected dues have built a legal defense apparatus deep enough to outlast almost any single prosecution. Hiring experienced defense attorneys capable of finding the one flawed jury instruction or the one fabricating witness that an entire case quietly depends on. A federal racketeering trial with 24 defendants can run for years and cost the government millions of dollars before a single verdict comes back. And the club's own legal fund, built dollar by dollar out of chapter dues going back to the 1960s, has shown it can match that timeline without the leadership ever missing a payment to a defense attorney. Prosecutors get one shot to build a case that survives appeal. The club, by comparison, only has to win once to send a years-long investigation back to square one. And the fourth, the one investigators are least comfortable saying out loud, is that the rivalries themselves, with the Hells Angels and now with the Mongols, may be doing as much to keep the club's internal discipline sharp as any bylaw ever could. An organization at war doesn't have the luxury of falling apart from within. So where does that leave the Vagos, 60 years after 13 men stood on a corner in San Bernardino and decided they'd rather build something than ask for permission to join? The federal government has tried to dismantle this club at least twice with everything it had. Raids involving hundreds of officers, undercover operations running years deep. A RICO case built on the back of a reversed murder conviction and aimed at putting the entire leadership away for life, and twice the structure has absorbed the blow and kept moving. Neither failure came cheap. Each investigation consumed years of agent hours, informant handling, and courtroom preparation, resources that, in a different case, might have gone toward a target that didn't have 60 years of institutional muscle memory built around surviving exactly this kind of pressure. The rivalry with the Hells Angels that started over territory and exclusion in the 1960s is still drawing blood on American highways 6 decades later. A newer war with the Mongols, a club that once stood on the same outsider footing the Vagos themselves were forced into, is escalating in real time, with bodies still hitting the ground in 2025. And underneath all of it, the original architecture, the bylaws, the dues, the patch hierarchy, the sergeant-at-arms keeping internal order, the slow climb from hang-around to prospect to fully patched brother is still running almost exactly the way it was designed to run in 1965. Today, estimates put the club's reach at somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 members spread across more than 200 chapters on 4 continents, still anchored to the same stretch of Southern California desert where it all started. Groups of 20 or 30 riders, green colors flying, are still a common sight moving through the inland empire and the high desert on any given weekend. Strip away the myth, the patch law, the courtroom drama, and what's left is something almost simpler, and in some ways more unsettling, an organization built by outsiders, designed from its first day to survive being hunted, that has now outlasted nearly every law enforcement effort built specifically to end it. Informants have gotten inside. Juries have heard the evidence. A jury instruction error once tore apart a murder conviction prosecutors thought was airtight, and the case built to replace it collapsed under the weight of its own star witness. Through all of it, the Green Nation is still riding, still recruiting, still burying its own and still standing over the bodies of its enemies. 60 years after a vote at a street corner decided what color flag it would all be carried under. Every law enforcement agency that has ever taken a serious run at this club has walked away, having learned the same lesson the hard way. You can arrest the man, but the patch outlives him. Presidents get convicted, get acquitted, get old, get buried, and the chapter keeps meeting on schedule the following week regardless. Informants spend years building cases stone by stone, and a single recanted witness or a single confused jury instruction can erase that work in an afternoon. It's not that the Vagos have never been touched. They have, repeatedly, by some of the most well-funded task forces in American law enforcement history. It's that touching an organization built this way has never been the same thing as ending it. Was Loki, the trickster who causes chaos but somehow always survives it, ever just a logo? Or did 13 bikers in 1965 accidentally pick the most accurate symbol possible for what they were about to build? 60 years, 3 major federal and state investigations, 2 collapsed prosecutions, and an active body count later, that question still doesn't have a clean answer. And as long as the rivalries on the highway keep escalating and the chapters overseas keep multiplying, it's not clear anyone is going to get one anytime soon.